Hi, so you should be watching this video after you finished watching the video where I gave you kind of a tour through part of the HBO documentary Lolly's Kin. So that was a depiction of the underclass lifestyle in the United States. And in the United States, we do have relative poverty. You saw those examples with Lolly's Kin. Please make sure you have a very thorough understanding of the three different types of poverty, and then also this topic that we're going to discuss today, human development, because Project 3 that's coming up is going to ask you to not define those things. I'm going to assume you know the basic definition. I'm going to ask you to apply that definition to a scenario. So I'm going to give you several different scenarios to read, and you're going to have to decide, okay, are they talking about a life-threatening situation? Well, then that must be absolute poverty, because that's the only type of poverty that's life-threatening. Are they talking about really you're doing okay, but you don't have the average standard of living, you're subsisting, but you don't have luxury items, you don't have the second part of life chances, like Lolly did not have luxury items, but she had everything she needed to subsist. Her life chances for clean water is probably not the same as your life chances for clean water. You probably don't have to drive to a municipal building with the hose outside and turn on the spigot and fill up bleach bottles to carry them back to your trailer because it doesn't have running water in it. But because we live in the United States, we have an infrastructure. Here's a very good college level word that we go over a whole lot in my cultural geography class, but let me explain it to you now. We have infrastructure in the United States, systems that the entire population can use. It's a macro scale part of the norms we expect in the United States. Infrastructure includes things like roads, bridges, airports, train stations, even those huge gas stations along the interstates. It includes waterworks, sanitation, and water supply that is safe, and a human is able to use it without making us sick or cause life-threatening situation like it would be if we were in absolute poverty. So Lolly's Kin was relative poverty. We have subjective poverty. You have a definition for that. We're going to talk about human development issues right now. And then I'm going to take you through a video, the last video this week. I'm going to take you through a scenario of another documentary, shorter than Lolly's Kin, where we look at a situation where there is no infrastructure to support the population. There is no income level to support the population. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and you need all of this, really good notes and a thorough understanding of all of this to ace Project 3, because that's what I want you to do. Okay, so we're going to talk about global stratification now, because really, even though the concepts we've discussed from the first part of this week until now, even though, and also in week 8, even though all of those things are about social stratification in general, we really only focused domestically. It means we only focused in the United States to examine poverty and social stratification. But when we move to the nations of the world, we have to define global stratification with a lot more complexity, because there's a whole lot of different ways to measure. You're not just measuring categories of people within a nation, you're measuring those nations compared to other nations in the world. You're categorizing those nations into different types of nations in comparison to each other. So there's a whole lot more detail that goes into global stratification. And we already had some complicated concepts already when we were talking about social stratification, just the initial introductory stuff. But with global stratification is about wealth, power, and prestige differences among the nations of the world in comparison to each other. But because the nations are so different in wealth, power, and prestige, the resources within them are so very different also for the people who live there, that the life chances among the people who live there are so different compared to other categories of nations. So look at the way I have written it more directly than the scenario I just described to you. but please be able to describe all of those nuances. Global stratification is not just comparing nations in the world like first world, second world, and third world nations like perhaps you have heard of before, or developed nations, developing nations, or underdeveloped nations, which refers to the amount of urbanization or infrastructure, industrialization too, and the economy, the type of economy and businesses that people are in. So it's more than just comparing nations, because that's like the ultra macro scale. But what does that tell us about the style of life? Remember, sociology is not just about macro scale, it's about the style of life on the micro scale too. So this second part of the definition of global stratification is really super important too, especially for a sociologist, because we want to know what are the life chances, what is the style of life, what's the average standard of living that a person who lives in one of those nations worldwide experiences on a daily basis. So nations can be compared to each other based on how much income or exports and imports they have. You'll read in Chapter 8 about GDP, gross domestic product, gross national product, some of these concepts that I go into more deeply in a cultural geography class. If you are interested in those distinctions, they're really fun to examine more in depth. But in sociology, we don't only want to just stop with looking at that global macro perspective. We want to say, okay, what's the style of life in a developed nation like the United States, or a first world nation like the United States? Well, we saw Lolly's lifestyle, and Lolly is pretty much systemic means macro scale. So systemically, the worst kind of poverty that we have in the United States on average is relative poverty. Lolly didn't have anywhere close the average standard of living or the expected style of life that probably you have for yourself that you enjoy right now, that I have for myself that I enjoy right now. She had a very different style of life than you and I do. But she had the support of infrastructure around her that made sure that all the resources she needed to subsist were in place. She did not have luxury. The kids did not have life chances for education like you do by going to this college right now. But she had impoverished conditions compared to other folks in the United States. When we look worldwide and we go to an underdeveloped nation or a third world country and we look at the average type of poverty that exists there, absolute poverty is typically the situation that we can find. So in Chapter 8, when it addresses absolute poverty, there's an additional piece of information that you need to stop right now and flip back to your notes where you wrote down the definition of absolute poverty from Chapter 7 when we went over it before. And pardon me, I'm going to ask you to add something else to that definition. Hold on one second. I need to clear my throat. Sorry about that. Thank you for pausing to let me go clear my throat. I guess it was more like a glitch in the video instead of a pause, but thank you. Okay, so in that definition of absolute poverty that you have from when we had a lecture about it together, I omitted a couple of things in that definition intentionally because we're coming to them in global stratification. And so before we address what human development issues are, and before we have our next lecture on those different levels, the different ways that we compare the wealth, power, and prestige among the nations of the world, let's talk about absolute poverty for a second. Worldwide, there is an organization called the World Bank. And the World Bank is not some place where you go and make deposits and withdrawals and pay your Visa card through an account that you have there. The World Bank is a watchdog organization that keeps track of statistics worldwide. It keeps track of economic statistics worldwide, which is one of the primary functions it does. And poverty is one of those economic statistics that it looks at. Urbanization, the degree of industry, human rights issues, those kinds of things, human development issues. So the World Bank keeps a track on all of these things and publishes reports about them annually. So in an investigation about absolute poverty conditions worldwide in underdeveloped third world nations, low income nations, they found that $1.25 of purchasing power daily is absolute poverty conditions. $1.25 of purchasing power. That does not mean that you have $1.25 in your pocket every day that you can dish out and buy something new. That means I have this sweater on, I have these reading glasses, I just had to use a cup of water to clear my throat, I blew my nose afterwards and I used a Kleenex. How much did all of those things cost? I've got electricity on right now, I've got running water in my house that I pay for, all of those things. I've got a house. How much does this homemade classroom that I have made for you and me, how much in my mortgage does this particular space within my household cost me? What about my bedroom? What is the amount of purchasing power that I have spent and that I take advantage of in my daily life? And so worldwide, when we're talking about $1.25 a day of purchasing power, we are talking about a lifetime of not being able to even come close to having wealth, having stuff, owning a house, let alone having access to something that gives you food resources, like being able to plant your own garden or something to produce your own food. So $1.25 a day is the World Bank's definition of absolute poverty. And when we look at that documentary I mentioned at the very end of this week's lectures, you're going to see yet more information about the definition of absolute poverty, because the United Nations Habitat Program has a definition of what we call a slum, and a slum is essentially absolute poverty conditions. When we watch that video, I will prompt you to take even further notes on absolute poverty. So worldwide, because there's such a difference in the nations of the world on the macro scale, and therefore the people who live in those nations have vastly different life chances from each other. I mean, some of you probably had tears in your eyes. I do when I think about the lack of educational opportunities that the kids in Lolly's Kin video experienced, or the way she laughed and thought it was funny if the kids were going to aspire for jail instead of aspire for an education. So if some of you were shocked and had tears in your eyes for that, please know right now that Lolly lives like a queen compared to some of the other nations, some of the people in some of the other nations of the world. The life chances are just not even close if you're charting them. Not at all. In the nations of the world where there are so few resources, no clean water, no food available, no housing available, in the nations of the world where extreme poverty is generational, is systemic, we have something that we measure worldwide called a Human Development Index. Now, this human development here is not about the level of economic development or industry in the nation itself. It's about the lifestyle of the people who live there. And there are three key factors in human development that we measure to see the degree of poverty and hardship that people do or don't experience in these nations of the world. So number one, we look at life expectancy. Life expectancy is how long is a person supposed to or possibly going to live in that particular location and time. I believe that it's the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a nation smack dab in the middle of the northern hemisphere part of Africa, where the average life expectancy is 42, 44, something like that, years. So, I'd be dead by now. I'm over that. So I would be dead by now on average in that particular place. And it's not because human beings can't survive longer than that. It's because of the lack of resources, the lack of infrastructure, and the absolute poverty conditions that people experience on a regular basis. Also, the education level, when it's very, very low, then typically poverty is very, very high in a nation. And that's primarily because without just basic education, I'm not talking about taking algebra in junior high school, I'm just talking about germ theory, like not knowing that if you wash your clothes and pee and poop in a river, the same river where you get your drinking water and your cooking water, you gonna die. Like, I'm talking about that level of education. So the higher you bring your education level up, the less likely you are going to see generational poverty in a place in the world. And also the standard of living. So what is the infrastructure like? Do they have paved roads? Do they have water resources? Do they have electricity? Do they have permanent structures for their housing? Or is it just more like cardboard and tin that can blow away in a windstorm? These kinds of things. What is the standard of living? Is there land for individuals to plant gardens to cultivate for themselves if other food resources aren't available? And so the standard of living here, if you're comparing your style of life to Lolly's style of life, that's a good thing. Keep up those comparisons, because that's the way that you develop that critical analysis kind of practice and synthesizing concepts like the definition of the type of poverty that we have in the United States, most common. Remember, absolute poverty does occur in the United States. It's just not nearly as common as worldwide because of the different standard of living, because of these different life chances that exist among the people, because of the different wealth, power, and prestige the nations of the world have in comparison to each other. Whew, did I say that in all one breath? Because that's a lot of comparison to be doing, but that's your job now, right? So it is your job to look at these things and analyze them. You have to read these scenarios that I'm going to present to you in Project 3. It's like, 2-3 sentences or something. And am I describing to you absolute poverty conditions, relative poverty conditions, subjective poverty conditions, or something that has to do with human development, which you can read more about in the first few sections of Chapter 8 in our textbook that's available online. So, human development issues, these are really paralleled with what life chances worldwide in these low-income nations is all about. So if your life chances for life expectancy is very, very low in your country, it's probably not because actually 42 or 44 years old is decrepit and you're dying from old age at that point. It's an average because maybe so many people in childhood are dying because they don't have immunities built up yet for the things that are systemic in the environment, like dirty water, like I've described to you, or a plague of some sort. And therefore, maybe children don't live until they're 3 years old, and that brings down the average life expectancy of anybody who does reach adulthood. Maybe there are some people who are 70 and 80 years old in that country, but if there's one of them and 40 babies who are dying before they are 6 months old, that brings the life expectancy average down, and therefore that nation would get a very low score in human development issues. If, for instance, the education level of the average member of the public is very, very low, perhaps that has to do with gender ideas that females are for reproductive and household functions, because in many places, education is not even a right for females because they have a different role and function in society. And many places that have childhood marriage. You and I would call it childhood marriage with our ethnocentric view about it. But in many places, females, when they hit puberty and begin to menstruate, are pulled out of school if they are allowed to go to that point to school at all. And therefore, the average education level across the board in that society is extremely low because you've got more than half of the population. Typically, there's a few more females in society than males. You've got more than half the population with a very low education level, or none at all, because some people can't afford to send their kids to school because they need them to work, and school is not paid for by a tax base in other nations necessarily, like it is here in the United States and the UK and other places in Europe. So, education level being very, very low is a human development issue. And then the standard of living. Do you have resources to subsist? Let's look at that first, because with absolute poverty conditions, you cannot subsist from day to day. You cannot take care of those who are dependent on you, and they might die because absolute poverty is a life-threatening situation. So, we're going to have one more video and look at the style of life with the different income levels. We're going to look at the levels of income approach to global stratification in our next video, and then I'm going to take you on that tour of the slum in Liberia, Africa that I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. So text me with questions. Bye.